The Emmy goes to
Breaking Bad.
Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad.
Bryan Cranston, Breaking Bad.
And the idea hit me. This very boring, law-abiding guy who actually decided to cook meth.
Vince Gilligan would like to see you about this show called Breaking Bad. I said, no.
Without this specific individual, the show simply wouldn't exist. Back in 2004, I called Tom Schnauz, a longtime friend and former writing partner from The X-Files. We had both been struggling to find work for 2 years and were unironically considering jobs as greeters at a local Walmart. He recalled a New York Times piece regarding a mobile narcotics lab, essentially a nightmare version of an ice cream truck. He cracked a joke about rigging up an RV as a mobile lab to bankroll a trip across the country. That witty remark sparked a massive epiphany for me, especially considering we are both such straight-laced, ordinary dudes. I realized that would be a fascinating character study. Imagine a regular guy who, pushed by a cancer diagnosis, actually decides to become a drug manufacturer. My goal was to take a mild-mannered teacher and transform him into a ruthless kingpin like Scarface. Now, Gilligan just had to find his perfect lead actor. I was lucky to have worked with Bryan on an X-Files episode in 1999. Later, I saw a commercial for Malcolm in the Middle and was completely caught off guard. I was watching TV late one evening when an absurd commercial aired featuring a quirky character in boxers and rollerblades. His face felt strangely familiar, despite the fact that he was totally smooth-shaven. Since Bryan sported a thick beard in our project, it took a minute for it to click. I was floored to realize it was the same actor, as I had no clue he possessed such comedic talent. After 7 years on that sitcom, I was getting flooded with offers to play the same goofy father figure. I knew I had to pivot to something completely different. I needed to distance myself from that world, so saying no was easy. Then I heard that Vince Gilligan wanted to see me regarding a show called Breaking Bad. Recall that guy? I told them it was a total no-go. Casting him was a nightmare since the room was packed with intense guys who felt way too over the top. But you didn't vibe with those actors. You were basically rooting for their failure. I initially refused to audition. I finally agreed to read the script and weigh my options. When I finally checked out the script, it was pure genius. Then Bryan arrived on the very last day. We were sweating because the schedule was so tight. He was one of the final 2 or 3 actors left. I felt a massive sense of relief the moment he arrived. The pilot script was phenomenal, opening exactly with the high-stakes imagery you see on screen today. Trousers falling through the air, a middle-aged man in his underwear wearing a respirator, and a van full of bodies and broken glass. I was sitting there wondering what on earth was happening. It was an incredible hook that grabbed me from the very first page. It was a rare moment where a script is so powerful. You know, every actor in Hollywood is going to be fighting for the part. However, Gilligan still faced a major hurdle. The big worry was whether the audience would actually root for him. He needed people to sympathize with the protagonist despite his increasingly dark and ugly choices. The network executives only saw the silly dad from Malcolm in the Middle, and they were ready to reject Cranston for the role of Walter White. Once I showed them his dramatic performance on that X-Files DVD, everyone's doubts vanished. Bryan then proceeded to prove the network wrong in ways they never expected. I modelled Walter White after my own father, who was 30 years my senior. I wanted Walt to carry himself like a man who was much older than his years. He seemed crushed by life, appearing decades older than his actual age. To capture that, I adopted my father's slouched posture and a weary, gravelly voice. I aimed for a pathetic mustache that practically begged for a razor. I thinned the hair until the pale skin showed through, creating a weak look. Initially, he feels like a ghost in his own world. But once he becomes Heisenberg, his shoulders square and his voice turns truly menacing. Say my name. Despite your kind soul, you possess a naturally intimidating mug. It's ironic because I've always felt my resting face looked quite frightening. It is funny because even when I'm showing zero emotion, people tell me my neutral expression looks like pure cold-blooded fear. Enter Walt's partner in crime, Jesse Pinkman. The original concept was for Jesse to be Walter's initial gateway into the criminal underworld. You understand the streets and I understand the chemistry. Jesse couldn't believe this old man with a stick up his arse was suddenly choosing a life of crime. When I landed this part, my career was at rock bottom. I was completely broke, biting my nails, and desperately needing a win. I needed this to work. Originally, the plan was to kill Jesse off at the end of the first season once his purpose as a guide was served. I had absolutely no idea that my character was slated to die so early in the show's run. That was the initial pitch to the networks. They made me wait 2 weeks for an answer because, honestly, Vince was the only one who actually wanted me. About halfway through the first episode, Vince realized he couldn't kill off such a vital character. He fought for me and made the network accept his choice. Jesse turned into a deeply complex and moral voice caught in the middle of a brutal drug trade. He became the heart of the show. You can't keep getting away with this. None of that emotional depth would have been possible without Aaron's incredible talent. 1 year in, Gilligan realized he'd struck gold, but lackluster numbers made avoiding cancellation a total gamble, echoing the uphill battle to secure a home. Interested buyers were non-existent, as most outlets felt the gritty, visceral, R-rated tone was far too risky. Back in 2005, there were far fewer platforms willing to take a risk on an edgy, rated series. We even pitched the idea to TNT. Both decision-makers were practically falling out of their chairs during my proposal. Their enthusiasm was matched only by my own excitement. That sit-down remains the absolute highlight of my career because those individuals were incredibly attentive throughout the talk. They were hanging on every word of the premiere's plot, especially when I reached the part about the motorhome filled with corpses. A heavy silence filled the room, and they just swapped knowing glances the moment I stopped talking. They confessed their love for the script, but feared being fired for producing such grimy content. Since illicit substances were too taboo, they begged to make the lead a simple counterfeiter. Besides the dark vibe, Gilligan struggled while pitching to every major network in town. He remembers sitting in those boardrooms and watching the executives' attention completely drift away. The project felt dead on arrival because the network rep showed zero interest in the premise. She basically ignored him the entire time, while constantly checking her wrist. Things looked grim. When I finished the pitch, she just offered a polite brush-off. The issue was simple. Networks only wanted safe, recycled formulas. Breaking Bad, however, was breaking every rule in the book. Most shows rely on a permanent status quo. For 30 years, Bart Simpson has stayed exactly the same age and personality. Historically, successful TV relies on static characters. Audiences love the reliability of inviting the same familiar faces into their living rooms week after week without any surprises. You can make a killing if a series runs for 10 or 15 years. That longevity is the holy grail for most producers in this business. But this show was built to be a total outlier, an experiment in transformation. It aimed to take a decent protagonist and slowly morph him into a cold-blooded villain. Every professional performer understands the constant sting of industry brush-offs, which is hard enough for standard roles, let alone a groundbreaking gamble like Gilligan's concept. The reality is even more ruthless, because official approval offers zero security. We sold the concept to FX, but everything stayed in limbo even after the teleplay was finished. After mulling it over, the executives finally declared the project was dead. Typically, these networks pay a tiny fee just to let a script rot in obscurity. Those suits usually stash every page within a storage unit indefinitely. Why obtain material without intentions of filming? They refuse to chance a 1 in a million shot where a rival studio develops a blockbuster that exposes their own poor judgment. Standard operations in this industry work like that. Corporate players purchase screenplays they never use to maintain authority. In their world, possessing assets translates to having total dominance. Occasionally, Tinseltown actually shows some heart. Even though FX rejected the pilot, they were generous enough to let AMC step in. They exhibited real integrity by permitting a competitor to acquire the rights to Breaking Bad. I really admire AMC for having the guts to air such a gritty story. Their boldness still floors me, especially since they rarely interfered with our creative choices. We only got one concerned phone call, asking if we were certain about a specific direction. They didn't block us, they just wanted to understand the logic. If you have watched it, you know the visual style is spectacular. It looks like a high-budget film, something normally impossible on a shoestring television budget. Initially, I planned to set the story in Riverside, California. That was because my old colleague from the X-Files, Frank Spott, suggested it. Frank's brother-in-law worked as a DEA agent in Riverside 5 or 6 years back. Since Gilligan lived in California anyway, it seemed like an easy win. Then the network proposed New Mexico for the savings. Why there? They offered a massive 25% tax incentive and rebate on every dollar spent. Whenever production teams invest in local labor, the government actually refunds 25% of those costs. This massive rebate is immediately reinvested into the cinematography. Ultimately, these financial incentives enable the series to maintain a remarkably high visual standard. That financial move was the catalyst. Ironically, trying to save money gave us that premium, cinematic look inspired by Sergio Leone and classic westerns. I love the sweeping landscapes of John Ford and Akira Kurosawa. Shooting in the desert made it feel like a modern western, something Riverside never could have captured. I am so glad we landed in Albuquerque. Everywhere in Southern California has already been filmed to death by every other production in town. New Mexico, however, felt completely untapped and fresh. Albuquerque became a vital character itself, providing a gritty, unique atmosphere that hadn't been overplayed yet. The show's brilliance was also its biggest hurdle. Even with critical acclaim and Cranston's Emmy wins, viewership was incredibly low for those first 3 seasons. Stateside, the series was hardly a household name at first, failing to pull in any significant viewership numbers. Despite glowing recommendations from friends and family, newcomers found it incredibly difficult to dive into the plot. You can watch any random episode of The Simpsons and get it, but you can't just start a complex movie or this show from the middle. That hyper-serialized structure was actually a bit of a double-edged sword. The very complexity that made the writing brilliant also acted as a barrier for the audience, nearly causing the show to be scrapped. Fortunately, a massive shift in how we consume media arrived just in time to rescue the production. Without that intervention, the series likely would have been axed after the 2nd or 3rd season. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say we would not be celebrating its legacy today without that shift. We have to give massive credit to streaming giants and on-demand technology for providing the platform it needed. The Netflix effect was a total godsend for our production. People binged the early seasons online just in time for the 4th and 5th. Suddenly, the numbers went through the roof and we became a global sensation. If you grew up in my era, you remember the agony and thrill of waiting a full week for a new episode. That anticipation made television feel like a major event. There was something special about that forced patience. Binging is fine, but it is like chugging a fine vintage wine instead of savoring every single drop. It was one of the final shows that functioned as a shared weekly experience. My friends and I treated every new episode like a mini Super Bowl party. That massive hype really elevated the show's mythology during its final run, especially with the 3rd to last chapter landing a historic 10 out of 10 score. It was such a solid payoff. A million things contributed to this show's legendary status and massive fan base. At its core, this serves as my tribute to a project that nearly failed before launch. Big respect to the visionaries who dared to redefine television. Why go through all this? Honestly, I did it for me. I was adrift and half expected to end up wearing a blue vest at Walmart. I am Adam. I'm Screen Puff, and thanks for tuning in to my debut upload. I launched this because growing up, I'd just soak up whatever happened to be playing on the tube or at the local cinema. At 13, I found the IMDb Top 250 list and became obsessed with elite filmmaking. As a performer and musician, I live for great art. There's a certain thrill in the creative grind, seeing a single spark forged into a cinematic masterpiece that touches the world. I've been profoundly moved by the silver screen, and chances are it has defined your own journey more deeply than you'd ever suspect. My goal is to dive into the fascinating backstories of our favorite on-screen moments. That said, I'm definitely still a rookie when it comes to the technical side of making these videos. I'm genuinely open to any tips or thoughts you might have. If you're down for more, go ahead and give that subscribe button the Joe Pesci treatment. Catch you guys in the next one.